What is going on, guys? Drew YGO back with another deck profile, and today we are doing King of the Skull Servants. Skull Servant is a really old Yu-Gi-Oh card. I believe it came out in Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon. It's just a zombie, level 1 zombie, normal monster, and I'm pretty sure it has like one of the lowest attacks in the game. This monster on its own is pathetic, but read its flavor text. A skeletal ghost that isn't strong, but can mean trouble in large numbers. And that's exactly what King of the Skull Servants does. This card, its original attack becomes the combined number of King of the Skull Servants and Skull Servant in your graveyard times 1,000. So, for the inexperienced person, you might say, okay, well, at max, you can get this up to 5,000 attack, right? And it has no protection, whatever. But there are lots of cards that become Skull Servant while in the graveyard, so you can pump this bad boy up to obscene levels of attack point values, right? So that's what this deck is all about, getting your Skull Servants and other cards that count as Skull Servant into the graveyard and swinging for a huge amount of damage. So let's go ahead and get into the deck profile. Excuse me. First up, we got 3 copies of the regular Skull Servant. You're not going to be playing it, you're just going to want to be dumping it into the graveyard, and we do have a lot of ways of doing that. Speaking of which, we have one Gozuki. During your main phase, you can send a zombie from the deck to the graveyard. If this card is in the graveyard or is sent to the graveyard, you can banish a zombie from the graveyard, except for Gozuki, to special summon a zombie from the hand, and you can only use it once per turn. But we only got the 1 copy because our normal summon is quite precious in this deck, and we should only be normal summoning Gozuki in very tight circumstances. Most of the time, you're just gonna want to be milling this card. Next up, we got the 3 copies of White Princess. This card's name is Skull Servant in the graveyard. If this card is normal or special summoned, you can send a White Prince from the deck to the graveyard. During either player's turn, you can send this card from your hand or field to the graveyard. All monsters currently on the field lose attack and defense equal to their own level or rank times 300 until the end of this turn. Now, for a card like King of the Skull Servants, who is only level 1, this is actually more detrimental to your opponent than anything else, because your King of the Skull Servants will be at like 13,000 attack, but it'll only lose 300 if you use White Princess. But if your opponent's got like a Baron de Fleur out, right, it's 300 times 10, it'll lose 3,000 attack, becomes 0 attack, right? So very, very awesome, and it allows you to mill your White Prince directly from the deck, which doing that is really great for this deck, and we'll get into why in a second. Next up, we got 3 copies of the Lady in White. Face up level 3 or lower zombies on the field, except for Lady in the White, cannot be destroyed by battle. Also, they are unaffected by spell and trap cards and effects. This card's name becomes Skull Servant while it's in the graveyard. It's got a pretty big booty with with 2,200 defense, so you can certainly set this face down on the field. But again, its most useful purpose is being sent to the graveyard, and also that effect where it protects your level 3 or lower zombies from spell and trap card effects is really nice, but like I said earlier, it's mostly going to be in the graveyard. Next, we got 3 copies of a relatively new card for the archetype, White Baking. This card's name is again Skull Servant in the graveyard. If a level 3 or lower zombie monster or monsters you control would be destroyed by battle or card effect, you can discard this card instead. If this card is sent to the graveyard, you can add 2 monsters with different names from your deck to your hand, except White Baking, that are either Skull Servant or specifically list Skull Servant in their text, then discard 1 card. So this kind of is like the glue for this deck, which is why I'm running 3 of them. I played around with the ratios of this a little bit, but I just really wanted 3 of White Baking in this deck. Having this in your hand and a King of the Skull Servants out on the field is really, really awesome, because if your opponent tries to get rid of it by some kind of effect, right, where they just blow it up, let's say a Raigeki or something, you can discard White Baking instead. And not only that, it also triggers its effect to add 2 of your white monsters or your Skull Servant monsters, and then discard 1 of them to just juice this thing up even more, which is pretty funny on your opponent's turn. Next, we got the 3 copies of White Mare. This card's name becomes Skull Servant while in the graveyard. You can discard this card, then activate one of the following effects. You can target one of your banished Skull Servants or White Mares and return it to the graveyard, or you can target one of your banished Lady in White or King of the Skull Servants and special summon it. So, because we do have cards like Allure of Darkness, and White Prince does banish to special summon King of Skull Servants, Let's see, where am I at? Okay, you can target one of them in the banish zone, put it back in the graveyard to juice this thing up by 1,000 more attack, or you can target one of your banished Lady in Whites or King of the Skull Servants and special summon it. So, King of the Skull Servants does have an effect where when it's sent to the graveyard, you can banish another King of the Skull Servants, or another Skull Servant, and then special summon this card back onto the field. With White Mare, you can put them back in the graveyard and juice it up even more. Next, we got 3 copies of White Prince. This is the card that can be milled off of White Princess. If this card is sent to the graveyard, you can send a Skull Servant and a Lady in White from your hand or deck to the graveyard. Then you can banish 2 Skull Servants and this card from your graveyard to special summon a King of the Skull Servants from your deck. This card's name becomes Skull Servant while in the graveyard. Like I said earlier, you can banish 3 cards from your graveyard to special summon out your King of Skull Servants directly from the deck. And if you'll notice, if you mill it with White Princess, you've got this card in the graveyard. Then you activate its effect, you get 2 more in the graveyard, you can activate its effect immediately to get out your big boy, right? So, White Prince is definitely a 3 of, along with White Princess. Finally, for the monsters, we got the boy himself, King of the Skull Servants. Like I said earlier, the original attack of this card is the combined number of King of the Skull Servants and Skull Servant in your graveyard times 1,000. So like I said earlier, I'm not going to do the math right here because I'll be here for a little bit, but you can get this card to obscene amounts of attack. It is the funniest thing to just drop a 13,000 attack level 1 monster out onto the field, and even having multiple of them. Because like I said, they can be special summoned pretty easily, and they're only level 1, so they can be normal summoned pretty easily. Next, we got the 2 copies of Allure of Darkness. I did play around with 3 copies of Allure of Darkness, but I ended up banishing too many cards. So 2 is where we're sitting at right now. You can draw 2 cards and banish a dark monster, and if you don't, you put your entire hand in the graveyard. So this can actually help if you want it to, but putting things in the banish zone, and if you don't have a way to get them back out, it might run into some problems, so that's why we're only running the 2 of them. Next, we're running the 1 copy of 1-for-1. I mean, this is for obvious reasons. Most of your cards are level 1, except for White Princess and Lady in White. But this can special summon King of the Skull Servants directly from your deck, but you can also send a monster from your hand to the graveyard as its cost. So let's say that you discard White Baking. Well, you discard White Baking, special summon King of the Skull Servants, it's at 1,000. Then White Baking mills 2 more cards, and then suddenly it's up to like 3,000 or 4,000, right? So this card is really, really great for the deck. 1-for-1 is already a really good card, but for this deck, it's just even better. Next, we got, obviously, the staple spells. We got the 1 Raigeki and the 1 Harpy's Feather Duster. Next, we got 2 copies of Polymerization. Now, you're probably saying, why? This is a Skull Servant deck. Well, we do have access to the Drago Necro Nether Soul Dragon, and it only requires 2 zombies, so you can fuse from the hand to get 2 of your Skull Servant cards into the graveyard, and you also get a pretty neat boss monster as well. Next, we got 2 copies of Pot of Extravagance. I did mention earlier that we do have some extra deck monsters that we'd like to go into, but at the end of the day, that's not your win condition. Your win condition is just OTKing with King of the Skull Servants. So banishing cards from your extra deck is not too bad. Next, we got 2 copies of Dark World Dealings. This card, you want cards in the graveyard a lot, obviously, so being able to draw a card, then discard a card that you want in the graveyard, like maybe a White Prince or a White Baking, is very good. It does let your opponent draw a card, which isn't the best, but we're running it because it's just an easier way to get your Skull Servants in the graveyard. Speaking of which, the best way to get any card into the graveyard is Foolish Burial. Then we got the Monster Reborn, just in case you want to get your King of the Skull Servants out. Next, we got the 3 copies of Burial from a Different Dimension. You can target up to 3 banished monsters and return them to the graveyard. When I first read this card, I thought it was really bad because I thought you had to have specifically 3, but no, it just says target up to 3 banished monsters and return them to the graveyard. The cost of White Prince might be kind of steep, where you have to banish itself and 2 other cards, but that is exactly 3, so if you have White Prince in the grave, you can activate it, then immediately use Burial from a Different Dimension to put all 3 of them back into the graveyard, which boosts your King of the Skull Servants by 3,000 on top of what it already was when it hit the field. Finally, for the main deck, 2 copies of Infinite Impermanence. Just a great card to have in any deck. Now, there are some cards in here which you can certainly use, but this is just filler for Pot of Extravagance. But I would recommend running the Drago Necro Nether Soul Dragon. You can drop this down to 2 since we're only running 2 copies of Polymerization anyway. But we are running 3 just in case we hit 2 of them off of the Pot of E. We do want 3 of these. Next, we got 2 Leviair, the Sea Dragon. You can target a banished level 4 or lower monster to special summon it. And we do have a fair few level 3 monsters to go into Leviair. And if one of your pieces is banished, you can go ahead and special summon off of Leviair, and also you get to detach one of the materials, whether that be your White Princess or your Lady in White, to boost up your King of the Skull Servants even more. Now this deck list is getting pretty long, so I'm just going to speed through the rest. The rest of this extra deck can be whatever you want, but I've got 3 Decode Talker, 1 Shooting Code Talker, 3 Link Spider, 2 Link Karibo, and 1 Salamangreat Almirage. These 3, or these, I guess, 6 cards right here, the Link Spider and the rest of these, can be used to get your level 1 monsters in the graveyard quite easily, along with your normal monster. That's it for the deck list, guys. This deck is so much fun to play. I feel like it can stand up to a lot of different decks because it's just so cheesy, it's just so fun. I love Skull Servant. Look how cute he is, man. Look at White Bacon. He's roasting some weenies, right? I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think, what decks you'd like to see next, and this has been Drew YGO. Until next time.